So hello and welcome to this webinar on co-production being an effective lived experience partner. First of all, I would like to thank UCB Pharma for supporting this project. They've had no say in the project or in the content of this webinar. The NHS is increasingly asking people to get involved in commenting on and deciding about what their services should look like. And today we're talking about how to be effective if you're involved in this work as someone living with an MSK condition. So just to be clear, the term MSK or musculoskeletal covers all conditions related to bones, joints, and muscles. So it includes things like all types of arthritis, back pain, fibromyalgia, and quite a range of other conditions. And today we've got three people with different perspectives on how you can be effective if you're involved in commenting on musculoskeletal services. Two of our speakers have lived experience of MSK conditions and knowledge and experience of co-production. And the third is a healthcare professional who really understands the value of hearing the views of those who use MSK services. So I'd just like to introduce, or get the panel to introduce themselves. So Christina, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Christina. I'm the National Lived Experience Ambassador in NHS England, but I have both physical and mental health conditions. I'm that person who has a carer, who actually has become a carer too, and multiple conditions in terms of MSK, and probably since birth because I've got Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but definitely last 20 years.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christina, and thanks for taking the time to join us. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark. Yes, I have lived experience of chronic pain, and I've been involved as a lived experience partner for the last 4 years or so in various capacities with the NHS. I helped to set up a peer support group for people with chronic pain in my area, and that led to me being invited to get involved with NHS England and others doing lived experience work, including co-production, so sort of a range of contributions.
Brilliant, and thank you for taking the time to be here. And finally, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth. I'm a physiotherapist. I clinically lead a large community and first contact practice service in St Helens. And I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my own experience of co-production influencing services in the place I work.
That's brilliant. Thank you again. Thank you very much for taking time away from a very busy role. So first of all, just to be clear what we're talking about, Christina, could you say a bit about what is co-production and what other ways does the NHS commonly use to seek the views of people who use their services?
Thanks, Sue. As we know, the word co-production's been around for a good while. Within the NHS, probably a lot less than the 25 plus years it's been in the community. And having been a community worker prior, working local authority, I definitely heard the word used in very different ways. In terms of within the NHS, it's about that equal partnership, having people with lived experience alongside people with learned experience. The lived being and living, because I always get challenged on that these days. The lived experience being those people who it's, through their own health or as a carer for somebody within their family or friends that they're supporting. So they have that rich experience as well. But that learned experience will be the people that are trained, that it's vocational, they're, medically trained or they've worked in the NHS a long time. And what we've realised since pandemic is we have what I call the third bubble. Haven't found a fancy name for it, actually. And that is those people with both. So it's really important that we're listening to everybody, and that actually it grounds it into reality that we are working in partnership to have that person-centered care. And that's what I think co-production really is. It's working in partnership. It's about everybody having an equal say rather than it being a group of people having more power than another group. Would you mind sharing the slide? Because I'm just going to mention, because I said that co-production has been around for a while, but actually we need to understand that involvement is really essential. Working with people and communities, and the statutory guidance at NHS England was released, and instead of having the participation ladder, which I kept joking saying kick it over, if anybody knows me knows I can't kick anything over. I've got arthritis of my ankle, and we co-produced this involvement flower. It turns out it looked like a flower. It wasn't meant to be a flower initially. But what it means is that actually we're doing a blended approach. There's not one area that's more important than another area. It's not like you have to go through a step process. Oh, and co-production's like, gold standard. Actually, we need to understand that relevant lived experience is important in the space, but also that all of these areas are important. So in the area that I work in, it tends to be co-production and co-design. If in co-production, it would be things like community development approaches, including asset mapping, appreciative inquiries, community conversations, where you're really getting out there and finding out what's happening and getting people involved right at the beginning. You might be co-designing alongside lived and learn, co-designing a new service or evaluating a service. But we need to remember it's still important to engage, consult, and inform. And actually, we have, a duty to actually consult about our services. But all of these are really important. So here we're talking about co-production today and why that's important to be at that standard where we're all at the table having an equal say. And we've very much done that, so haven't we? During the pandemic, it was definitely strengthened, and having that executive buy-in from the National Clinical Director, without a doubt, has meant that we're still here 3 years later, very much a team, even when we're not working in the same places, but pulling together, and the real belief that co-production is important.
Thanks very much, Christina. And some of you on this webinar or watching the recording may well be involved in all those different ways that Christina showed in that flower. Mark, could you tell us a little bit about your experience of being involved in co-production and why this is something that you choose to do?
Yeah, yes. So I was, as I mentioned before, I was initially sort of involved without realizing it by running a support group locally, which was sort of very much a patient initiative, and that sort of led me into an element of co-production, working with local services. And in fact, yeah, I had a sort of a mentor and somebody who very much encouraged me to get involved. In fact, almost sort of, yeah, strongly encouraged, and that was in fact Christina. So I've worked with Christina a lot, a sort of declaration of interest there. And so I got involved in doing sort of various types of lived experience partner work, some of which were co-production and some of which were other petals, more in the sort of involvement sort of spectrum. And yeah, I found once I got involved initially, I found it to be very fulfilling and enjoyable, and I just felt it was important that people were playing a part in helping to shape service, because it just meant they were going to be better. And so yeah, and that sort of led on, and I got involved with stuff doing I'm in Camden in the borough level at North Central London. And London. I have various roles now. I've just kept saying yes because I enjoy it so much, and I did a lot with NHS England, working with the Experience of Care co-production team, Christina, and I did a lot of stuff with the MSK area. In terms of actual co-production, I would say some of the things that I think it's never completely perfect. It's not but I think certain things pass the threshold, or you can really call it co-production. So a lot of the things I did with the MSK team, again with Christina's involvement, were things like actually to some extent co-producing what we meant by co-production in that space. We had a lot of work around things like, to give just a couple of examples. One was I was very much involved in helping to co-produce sort of the results or the findings of a survey of what people's experiences with MSK and chronic pain conditions were under lockdown, and sort of turning that into something that could be used to actually formulate the best MSK NHS England policy. And then around the sort of MSK adoption fund we had, I was very much involved in helping select the successful applicants to that fund. So that was fully co-produced. So it was 50-50 between healthcare professional and me as the lived experience partner in determining who was going to be selected. So that was, I think a very, that was a strong example of it. And yeah, also just briefly, I've been involved in other projects which are more voluntary sector, but which also involve clinicians and healthcare professionals. And what I'm finding is a really good attitude towards co-production and involvement amongst a lot of people, but also a willingness to understand that there isn't a perfect template yet, but it's evolving, and therefore as long as Christine says people people in leadership positions buy in and have a good attitude, then we can sort of develop precisely what it means in different contexts, in a way which is, more evolutionary. So yeah, I've had a really good experience. It's given me a lot, and I've felt good to be able to make a contribution after taking a lot out of services over the years with my condition.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So hopefully that's making everybody feel like this would be a great thing to be involved in. Ruth, coming at this from the healthcare professional angle, what's your experience of co-production and why have you been involved?
I think the reason why I've got involved is because from my experience, as Mark and Christina have said, if you involve co-production, it will improve your service delivery and development. So if you take, for example, just having a group of professionals sat in a room developing a new pathway or service, there's a real danger you'll make too many assumptions about what is important to people if no one in that room has experience of living with that condition. And there's no way that approach can be as effective as working with people with lived experience as equal partners in developing your service. So we know from evaluation of services that use a co-production approach, there are positive benefits for both individuals and also the efficiency of services as a whole. But when I was thinking what I'd do for this webinar, I thought it might be useful just to go through a specific MSK example from my own service, which I think hopefully shows the benefits of co-production in action. So at the beginning of last year, we did a project for the Cheshire and Merseyside MSK network using a co-production approach. And we were considering the initial part of the MSK journey. So when people presented with their first MSK pain or problem in primary care, and to the point where they were either referred onwards to secondary care or they were discharged. So we're looking at that very early part of the journey to see whether we could improve things. So to do that, we gathered together a group of people with lived experience of MSK conditions, and we met over a period of 5 sessions. So initially, we started those sessions by letting each person on their group tell their own story of their experience and their journey through health services before we started to even discuss any potential new pathways. And during those initial services, people really got to know each other well, and we were able to pick out common themes of things that were working well and areas where improvement was needed. And then we went right back to the beginning of their journey and said, well, what would be the ideal situation? What would the ideal be if we started again? And this worked well because as people had already told their own stories, they appreciated by listening to each other. There were loads of different experiences that could positively influence a new pathway. So we learned loads of things from that co-production work, and the MSK services involved changed a number of things as a result of what they heard. But the biggest change in our service related to the development of a new pathway for patients with fibromyalgia. And the reason we focused on that was because there was a subgroup of people in our co-production group with lived experience of fibromyalgia who'd had a particularly difficult journey through health services. And this themed into 3 key areas. Late diagnosis, people were repeatedly attending their GP practices, were often passed between services, and they were waiting for a long time on waiting lists. The second theme was not really understanding their condition or what may help. And the third theme was being seen once, told all their tests were negative, and then just being discharged with a leaflet about fibromyalgia. And what people told us is that they needed a lot more support and guidance to really understand and manage their condition effectively. So we tried to develop a pathway to ensure these themes were addressed. And we also asked one of the ladies on the group who had fibromyalgia, would she sit on our steering group when we were developing the new pathway? And that was to keep us on track and keep us true to co-producing that service. So some things we included to address the themes the patients, the people have brought up, were a rapid access diagnostic service. We developed education services. We developed a combined talking therapist and MSK group, a confidence to exercise group, and we made lots of links with local community services to support people when they were discharged from our services. But overall, we tried to ensure a personalised care approach was embedded throughout that pathway. So that new pathway has been operational now for about a year. And so far, we've had great feedback from people going through the pathway, and we're seeing good evidence of clinical outcomes. But the reason I've chosen that particular example is because after we'd finished that co-production work, we produced a guide of how we went about that co-production work. And we also made a video which includes interviews with people about their experience of going through that new pathway. And when you see that, it's a positive testimony from the people with fibromyalgia that went through the pathway that's so compelling. And I think that really strongly reinforces the value of co-production. So if you go back to Sue's original question, I just thought by showing you that example, hopefully it will go some way to demonstrate why it's so important to hear the views of people who use MSK services if you're going to deliver effective care.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ruth. And that's a really good example of what we're looking for here in terms of co-production, of people with lived experience, people who know what it's like to use the services, actually having an impact on what the services look like into the future, and how much more effective that can be by involving people who really know how it feels to go through the service. So this webinar is to accompany a guide to co-production that we produced earlier this year. Anybody watching the recording, we will put the links in the notes below the webinar on YouTube, and we'll email them to people who've registered for the webinar live. And so now I want to move into picking up on a few practical things to do with how to be effective when you're engaged in this sort of work. So Mark, perhaps I could start with you. If you were going to be attending a meeting in relation to some aspect of co-production or involvement, how would you prepare? How would you go about preparing for that meeting?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I would have to first thing I have to take into account my condition. So, and the state of my particular chronic pain level, for example, and I think that would probably apply, to anybody doing co-production who would have a condition, usually. So, so my first sort of, in terms of the advanced planning, would be: is the meeting in person? Is it face to, if it's going to be face to face, I'd have to think about my travel. I'd also be thinking about issues about, potentially the cost. If I'm going to be, if I'm going to be, if I'm going to have to incur cost myself to get there, and am I going to get at least my travel, or I'd be interested also to know in terms about, something we'll probably talk about in terms of what is the reimbursement policy? Is there going to be a payment for me? Am I going to be valued in that sense as a lived experience person? And there are things I do which I don't get paid for, which I'm happy to do as a volunteer, but then, but increasingly that is a thing. In terms of my other preparation, I just make sure I read the materials. When you have a long-term condition as I do, you do have to plan quite carefully. So I make sure I'm going to be able to, get there. It's going to be okay for me, and that if it's online, then I'll increasingly now, as I think we were discussing beforehand, people, I feel very comfortable with it, but otherwise I would want to make sure that I would contact them in advance to make sure that the tech was going to be all right for me. But yeah, I think the main thing for me is just making sure I've prepared myself as well as I can in terms of doing the reading, and probably having a few questions in mind that I could raise, because I think it's important that if I'm going to be there, I'm going to contribute, and I'm not going to be as well versed in the materials as many of the other people there. So having something in mind that I can raise is a useful fallback. But I will, if possible, I would try to raise something spontaneously that arises out of the meeting. But yeah, those are probably the main things for me.
Thanks, Mark. And Christina or Ruth, do either of you want to add anything to that answer?
I'm happy to go next if that's okay, Ruth. I was just thinking about how we've prepped in the past, Mark. Mark's always very humble, saying that people in the room might know more than him. Not always. So we find that sometimes we go into meetings and not everyone has read the notes. Quite possibly, I'm guilty of that. It depends on whether the information's been sent that's accessible. So I think things like that is really important. But in my role now as the person that was chairing the National Musculoskeletal Lived Experience Group, it was how do we make sure people have everything they need to be comfortable in that meeting so that they can actually contribute without being, worried about not having the materials in enough time in advance. We have people that need it, maybe a week before, which sometimes isn't possible. It's about being honest that, the notes for this meeting are only going to come out a few days before. And if that's the case, just giving somebody a phone call and saying, look, they've landed. I know it's a lot of notes, but this is the things that you actually need to look at. I'm not going to be reading all of it. And it just breaks that down and to make it more of a human interaction, and so that people that aren't used to that kind of setting feel more comfortable, realize that we're all just people in a space wanting to improve together. And I think that's really important, is to make people comfortable and recognizing not everybody contributes in the same way. So some people can be very vocal, some people might like to email afterwards, or they might use a chat function, and it's being open to people contributing in a different way. And just, not everyone wants to talk in front of a camera. We've done loads of it, especially during the pandemic, but actually having started to do face-to-face, it's like, oh, it's a total different world to me now. So it's that thing of how can everybody contribute? Would I do anything different with a team? If I was on a project team, I would do the same thing. If there was a new member, if there was somebody that wasn't as extrovert as me in the team, I would support them as well. And I think we need to be recognizing just because somebody has a lived experience, partner role, it doesn't make them any different to anybody else in that project team.
And Ruth, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I was wondering if people are not getting what they need, would you advise them to say to whoever's invited them, this is what I need?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things we did that worked well as a service, if you're thinking of doing this kind of work, is we had one link person that worked with those people beforehand, talked about expectations, we had a lot of IT problems still, Christina and Mark, of people scared to come onto the environment. Christina, to go back to what you said, they didn't want the camera on and things like that. And you have to take people individually through that. But linking one person, having one link person for them that contacted them before, debriefed and gave them the materials they needed, has really worked well.
Great, thank you very much. And Christina, if someone's not used to being in meetings, so some of the people with lived experience who get involved will have had roles where they've been in meetings and they're very comfortable with all of this. But there's a lot of people whose jobs in the past have not involved a lot of meetings and may not feel comfortable in that setting. So what advice would you give to someone in that position about how to make sure your contribution is effective?
So in terms of, I think about an NHS England, when we were pulling together the lived experience group, we actually had a role descriptor. So the expectations, so like you said, Ruth, about the expectations of people knowing. So there would be an element of, with some of the strategic work we did, there would be an element of that they would have had done some meetings already. But if we were doing a project, and it might be a project where absolutely everyone's new, we would do a pre-meeting. So, because sometimes you could go to a meeting, there's like 30, 40 people plus, some of them, the musculoskeletal ones had hundreds in them. And, and IT still failed in some of them. And it's like how you can have humor around that. So it's actually a pre-meet, just lessens people's nerves. But, again, that touch point, I tend to be that person, Ruth, with the musculoskeletal work. We also have WhatsApp groups in the background so that if something's going wrong on the screen, we didn't do it today actually, Sue, but it's a smaller group. But WhatsApp, so somebody can send a quick text and just say, I can't hear, what shall I do? And you can just say, come out, come back in. It usually works. It's like putting the computer on and off, isn't it? But it's that thing of just being that person that's there. So even if they don't text you or they don't contact you, but it's that stability of knowing that person's available, but also, trying to find out who will be in the audience so that people have an expectation. Because sometimes you go to a meeting, you're, oh, didn't know there'd be the national clinical director. Whereas, if somebody met Andy, they'd be like, absolutely fine. And no, he's really down to earth. So I think it's that thing, but also the debrief, so that if things haven't gone right, you can just build on that. It's, it's nothing to mistake. It's always a learning experience. And so that you can build upon that when you go into the next meeting. So people feel a bit more prepared, and offer people training. So it may be that they want to facilitate, they want to be able to chair a meeting. Then why not offer them some training to be able to do that and co-chair a meeting, build people's confidence? And I think it's giving people opportunities in lots of different ways is important.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mark, I wonder if you've got any reflections. That's Christina's outlined the ideal way of doing this, but I know you will have had the experience of arriving in a meeting where you're the only person who's not a healthcare professional. How do you make sure that your voice gets heard in amongst all the professionals?
Yeah, so I mean, again, going back to the previous point about preparation, if I feel comfortable, and it's very important that as was said, that one gets the materials in a timely fashion if possible, or at least on the same terms as everybody else. But if I feel I've done some reading, then I feel a lot more confident that I'm going to be able to make a good contribution. I would say again, as Christina said, it's an experience thing. You can't buy experience really. You just have to earn it. And if you haven't done a lot of this, then just be confident that you will develop those skills by attending. And I think in the early meetings, I probably wouldn't say as much as I do now. I listened more. I got the measure of things. You can contribute in the chat again, as was suggested. Maybe if you don't feel confident speaking, if that type of meeting, which a lot of them have been, and just build up the confidence that way, and know that what you're there for a reason, and what you have something valuable to contribute. And I've never really felt under huge pressure to stay or do anything. I think you can contribute as much as you like, but I think it's good and it's good to listen anyway to what other people have to say. And I think it will have more impact if, when you contribute, it's clear that you have been listening and you are very much engaged with what's going on. And then, as you develop more confidence, you might be able to take more initiatives and speak for a bit more. But it's people will get there. If they're there for a reason, and they will, over time, they'll get more and more confident and used to it, and be able to contribute more and more.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ruth, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that one. Fine if you don't.
I was, from a service point of view, if you're bringing people into a meeting who've got lived experience, from my perspective, that is just so valuable. And the other people around the table, if there's a few of you and you're the only one that sat there with lived experience, everyone realizes the value of that person in the room. That is my experience. And when I've been chairing and facilitating meetings, I will try my best to try and encourage people to get their opinion over. I'll check the agenda beforehand and think of areas where we can really pull in their opinion. But it's just having the confidence to realize that we are so grateful to having anyone with lived experience in that room to help guide us to deliver effective services.
I think that's a good thing to remember, is you were invited for a reason.
Yeah.
So somebody in that room really wants to hear what you have to say. Mark, did you want to come back on that? I
was just going to say that my experience, and I think others here will know this as well, that there's such a positive attitude to I've experienced with people that have experienced. I mean, it's almost not quite 100%, but it's very, very high. And I've been in a lot of different organizations, a lot of different meetings, and there's a real enthusiasm and a positivity. And so, if you do get involved in doing this stuff, you can expect to be encouraged, supported, and valued in meetings, in the overwhelming majority of cases. So, I mean, that's genuinely been my experience.
Brilliant, thanks. That's good to know. So if you're involved in this sort of work and you're sitting in a room and you're listening carefully to everything people are saying, someone is going to say something that you vehemently disagree with, like potentially something that makes you very, very cross. It's inevitable. The whole point of co-production is to get lots of views into the room. But I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on how to handle it if you really, really disagree with something. Christina?
I'm laughing because I've had to learn this skill. So yeah, I'm like, sitting on my hands and, even learning to put my hand up in the space. I think you touched on something there, Mark, about gaining like that experience in those spaces. And I think what's important is that people are not just bringing their own story, but they're bringing the story of like their network and networks. So it's, a collective story rather than just their own. So sometimes if you're coming with just your own story, it can become quite emotive. It can be quite, upsetting if it's not what your experience was, etc. And I think sometimes you need to just, again, sit and listen and try and understand where what where the person's come from. But on other times, let's be honest, like any meeting, there'll be somebody that's going to grate you, and there's the hands up function. And I would hope that whichever space I've been in with lived experience people, they would be asked to speak just like anybody else. It would be um, it may be that if it's something that you think that you need to take outside the meeting, put it in the chat. Tag the person and say, could we potentially have a conversation about this afterwards? A lot of people will say yes, and if you're not comfortable having that kind of heated debate, and sometimes it's not appropriate, is it? And then other times too, I'm sure you've seen it where I'm like, nope, that's not why, where's the lived experience in this? And it's where it's appropriate, where it's if you're in a place where it's safe and you feel like your views are trusted, then actually you'll feel more and more comfortable to speak up. If you're in a space where it's tokenistic, you don't feel like you've been listened to, then potentially you need to go back to that person that's brought you into that meeting, that touch person, Ruth, that has been supporting you and saying, well, hang on a second, this isn't what my expectations were. I would like to kind of discuss what the purpose of me being in this meeting is. Where's the value added of having lived experience in the meeting? So sometimes it's not just the person going in with lived experience, but also the learning experience. It's a different way of working. And we need to understand that, there might be a period of settling in, you could say, where people have to get used to each other being in the space together.
Brilliant. Thanks, Christina. And Mark and Ruth, I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that.
I can say something, or Ruth, you go ahead if you want to go next.
No, Mark, you go. That's fine.
Yeah, so generally, I'll preface it by saying I actually don't find myself getting triggered or annoyed that often in meetings. Most of the time, I find people are, really quite sensible and reasonable. You're not going to agree with everything, but what I've found is that I did some training with the NHS Leadership Academy, I think it's called that. I think, and so I had, which was really useful. So I would recommend doing something like that if you're interested in becoming involved in this lived experience partner work and co-production. And there was some excellent advice given to me there about that you can. It's okay to challenge something that you don't agree with, and you can say something which potentially could be seen to be quite contentious, or not contentious, but in strongly disagreeing with what's been said, as long as you say it calmly and respectfully and reasonably, then people will generally listen. And I had one experience I did have where I did have to sort of challenge something. I thought, well, they're not going to invite me back when it comes to reappointment or whatever. I've sort of burnt my bridges with this lot. In fact, they did. And so they actually, even though it was a little bit difficult at the time, I followed the advice I was given, and actually it was valued that somebody was prepared to challenge and say something difficult, which I don't have to do very often. But so yeah, actually I've had a pretty positive experience of that.
Great, thank you. And Ruth, did you have anything?
Yeah, just to go back to what Mark was saying about that peer-reviewed programme, we were very lucky when we started this piece of co-production work that we worked with NHS and people from NHS Improvement that had been involved in that programme, Mark, and also advised us, had done lots of co-production work and advised us. When we were in a group, that initial advice that they gave us about let people tell their stories to begin with and everyone listened to each other. Now, people disagreed. There were things that were different and people had some very bad experiences, but letting that sort of come out first before we sort of took a breath and said, well, let's start again, and let's look at how things could be different, really worked well. So that's one tip I can give you. We found that was really helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Christina mentioned this next question very briefly, which is the fact that you're not necessarily sometimes you will be there to bring your own personal experience and views. But sometimes, for instance, Ruth said we invited one person to sit on a steering group who will then be the only person with lived experience in the room full of professionals. Have any of you got any tips on how you can make sure that what you say in those meetings is not just your personal view, which, as Ruth said, other people may have a different experience, but is genuinely bringing a breadth of lived experience into the room? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I've had to do this quite a bit in a variety of roles I've done. I mean, one thing I would say is that it helps if you are connected to, I think what we call a network of networks or whatever. So I'm involved with a group, in fact, several groups, but one group in particular, which is, peers with chronic pain, which is a sort of democratic, sort of egalitarian group where we all share our experiences and knowledge. So so that helps, and I think there are a lot of people who are involved with that sort of thing, and therefore those people can be very well suited to being involved in lived experience partner co-production work. But and others can as well, bringing a different perspective. So I think also the fact that you as somebody who uses services, as somebody who's has there are transferable sort of or skills or experiences, and if you're empathetic and imaginative about, and you sort of test, I find what I do is I would test, sort of almost put myself in the position that I was trying to use a service, even if it's not something I normally do. Where I mean, I'm giving I'm co-producing or giving my involvement. I would try to think through, what is it that people would want? What is it that a patient might need or a carer in this circumstance, and just test it and see what the responses are. So I think you can be imaginative and creative about that.
Thanks, Mark. And Christina, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to think there would be one. I'm now advocating for there being more than one when possible, because with musculoskeletal conditions, quite often they're chronic conditions because the people are at a point of their journey where they're able to give back, not at the beginning of a journey where, they might be quite still very much in the system. So I'm somebody 20 years into my arthritis journey, but actually very much still having, treatments and etc. I feel comfortable talking about it, but actually somebody else might not be. So sometimes it's good for me to be with somebody who's just entering, because then you can work off each other. So you have that new experience as well as that, I'm part of the furniture and people know me at my local hospital very well. So it's like, oh, here she comes again, So it's that kind of thing of having that viewpoint. Sometimes you can support each other by having very different experiences. But in the same space. But the other side of it is, if you are the only person, is how are you using that network? So Mark's been very humble, but he set up, co-founded that patient-led peer support group, which I still go to get peer support. Even though, when I was supporting them originally, I was patient director of the musculoskeletal service. But actually, I value that support and the value that I'm hearing many more stories. Lots of people use that patient groups on social media, etc. How do we make sure that what they're bringing isn't just the views of one particular group? So sometimes we tend to hear quite vocal people on patient groups, say on Facebook, etc. And how do we help people build the skills to bring more balanced view, so it's not just bringing in whatever's that hot topic of the week that might actually be a bit of anger behind it because of there might be something in the media, etc. So we need to just build on people's skills to be able to bring in what's relevant to that meeting, but also bringing it in a way that isn't combative and not coming in to kind of start an argument, but actually, look, I've heard this, how can we change this? This is happening locally. If it's a local project, this is the news out there that sometimes clinicians don't know. And I know that I've done that myself within my musculoskeletal services, going, oh, people are talking about this particular part of the service, and it's how you bring that in. And if you have that trust built up with the rest of the team, then it'll be much easier to bring that in. But if you have just got one person coming in, they're coming into a patient story, then make it a story with purpose. So there's a reason for them coming in. If it's a particular new pathway and somebody's just gone through it and they're coming in and that's the purpose, just be really honest and transparent. That's the reason they're there. But if they're there to build a new pathway, then it's a different skill set, isn't it? It's a different, I don't know what you think about that, Ruth, but it depends on when that lived experience is coming in and what the purpose is.
Yeah, I think so, Christina. I think I'll take on board what you said about not just having one person in the group. I can see someone in the chat has agreed with you on that. I think on the journey we went with our patients when in the fibromyalgia work and also some other work we've done is if they've listened to other people's stories to begin with, then they're more primed, like Mark said about being members of peer review group, not just to speak about their experience. And I think you can facilitate that as well within groups by asking about what people have told us, what their thoughts are. And so they don't just talk about their one story. So I think that's how we managed that. I totally get your point about try and get more people on your steering group, not just in your redesign groups to start with.
Yeah. Oh, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think, I mean, Ruth is already doing this and Christina champions it, and it's relevant lived experience is important, if at all possible. It isn't always, and I think that as somebody who's there as a lived experience partner, where there isn't relevant, then it's something that you can speak out for and champion and say, well, let's try and get some of those people involved, and let's have more diversity and inclusion and equality in the process. So you can do it indirectly as well, I think.
And as Christina said, lots of people are involved in whether it's online or face-to-face, local groups, national charities. Maybe just listening to what you're hearing in those groups and bringing that along with your own experience can be useful. And certainly, I think some of the ARMA patient organisations are happy to give people a bit of support around understanding some of the different perspectives. So we've had a question in the chat, which is an interesting one. So it says, how does co-production fit with other NHS England initiatives such as GIRFT? Seems to be some crossover. So just to explain GIRFT, it stands for Getting It Right First Time, which tells you very little about what they do. But what they actually do is service improvement work. So they look at data around where services might be able to improve, and then they go into local areas and local services and support them to look at how they might change. So does anybody have any thoughts about where the links might be, Christina?
Well, if we go back to when the Best MSK Health Collaborative was put together and GIRFT were involved as one of many people that were involved in that, we work with them. So within NHS England, outside MSK, just this week, I've been given some funding for some lived experience partners, and it came from GIRFT. So it's not one or the other. I think it needs to be hand in hand. Much more. I'd love it to be much more, but we slowly, because some people are more focused on data, whereas we bring in that human factor, don't we? So I think it's not either or. I think it is working more together and across less of that silo working. And I think that's what we championed really during the pandemic, was there was less silo working and people just coming together to improve. And I think that's mainly what I'm going to say, but it depends on each program of work, doesn't it? Within MSK, me and Mark were actually involved before it was even best MSK Health Collaborative, and yourself as well, Sue, that we were just pulled together. I'd actually joined NHS England coming from a role as a local MSK patient director to come to NHS England in a very different role in the experienced care team, and it's that you get drawn back in, don't you, to experiences that and so I was asked, it's MSK, would you like to come? Yes, and I'd like to bring Mark along, and that's what happens. It's that those connections, and that's what what builds upon it as well.
I don't know if Mark or Ruth have anything they want to add to that.
Nope.
Well, just to say that, just to echo that, yeah, I've seen that having been in a lot of meetings and GIRFT has been a sort of been involved, and it's been a topic that I know that there's a strong drive to make sure that the lived experience component, which has really been pioneered and piloted by MSK, NHS England MSK, alongside the co-production team Experience of Care, that isn't lost, that is still embedded and is part of the process going forward. And that's certainly what I've been seeing, and I find that very encouraging.
That's really good. That's really good to hear that. because that's where the co-production around GARF really needs to happen, isn't it? That bit where they come in and say, this is what needs to change locally. We need some lived experience voice in that room. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So we're coming towards the end of our time. So I just wanted to wrap up this webinar by asking each of you in turn, what's the one thing you would say to someone who has never done this before and is perhaps considering it? Christina.
We have got a question in the chat though, so I don't know if you want us to quickly look at that.
The one about regional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So are the experiences regionalized, or is that about gaining insight from peer groups is the question?
Well, when we were just referring to that peer support, so the one where I'm involved with Mark is very much a local, and I was connected when I was working at that trust, but in terms of my role now, it would be international, in fact. So the pain community internationally are quite tight in terms of lived experience, and social media and just technology makes it a lot easier to have a Zoom call or a Teams call with people in lots of different places. So I think gaining insight from peer groups can be anywhere. I think it depends on a piece of work, and sometimes you can just say, look, we're doing this about knees and hips, and we're doing a source, like solving together, and it's crowdsourcing, isn't it? So that's open to anybody. Anybody can put in an idea. So I think we're working in a very different way, and it's very much more open. People can give their ideas in a less structured way, or they could join in more structured co-production. And I think it's what works for people. Depends on the person. Some people want the methodology, and there are things like the Always events, which is methodology. There are lots of different ones, and I'm quite happy for you to share my details afterwards if anybody wants to have any of the resources that we have at NHS England.
Brilliant, thanks. And yes, I think it should happen this should be happening at every level. So whether it's the smallest change to a local service, or Best MSK Health, which was a big national program. Ruth, did you want to come in?
Yeah, not on that. I'm just wanted to comment on another comment that's been made in the chat by Richard, who says that also letting people know about the impact of their involvement is important. And again, this is something that NHS Improvement really encouraged us to do. So every time we debriefed after every session we had, and then every time we went back on, we'd play back really what we'd heard to people that told us about their lived experience. But we'd also, right from the beginning, we sequentially made changes in our MSK services based on their feedback, and we would tell them what impact that was having, what we'd done so far, and what a difference it was making. And that really helped to keep people engaged. If you just leave people sort of talking in a room and don't give them any feedback about what's happening and what difference is that making, I don't think it's quite as effective. So that sort of strategy worked for us quite well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, well, just responding to what Ruth said, I think that's 100% right. I think that's something I've heard, I feel, and I've heard a lot of other people, lived experience partners, say the same thing, that if you don't feel as if what you're sort of shouting into a void, you don't really know what happens next. That's quite frustrating, and also it doesn't feel as if you're not valued as much. So they can't be bothered to tell you what happened next. So I say they, but so I think that's a really good practice in terms of the peer element and what the question and what Christina was saying. I think it's good to have. I mean, when one of the things that's really good in the area that I've been working in North Central London and Camden is that the services now are talking to groups of peers and people with relevant experience of particular conditions, and bringing those groups together as a group of peers who will then bounce ideas off each other and develop their own sort of internal identity or sort of character and be more fruitful in terms of what they produce and be able to feed in terms of co-production. So I think working with peers with relevant lived experience, and also I think peer support is something which is being increasingly recognised as something that's very valuable in terms of treating all sorts of conditions, particularly long-term conditions. So I'm really pleased to be involved with that and working with other people who do that to try to push that forward.
Brilliant, thank you. So then just to round up the session, maybe starting with Christina, what's the one thing you would say to someone who has never done this sort of thing before and is considering
it? In terms of a lived experience person?
In terms of a lived experience person, yes.
So there's something that Richie mentions in the chat about trauma tourism. Be at a point where you're comfortable with sharing. I've been very fortunate. I was a peer coach where I was trained to be able to discuss my health conditions, my disabilities, in a safe manner. That meant that I can go away and majority of the time feel psychologically safe. And I think sometimes if you're very early on, and I witnessed this within long COVID, when I was involved in groups there, that when it's very raw and it's very new, it can take a lot out of you. It still takes a lot out of you. I'm not going to lie. I've been doing this a while now. And, there are times where I'm absolutely exhausted, just sharing a part of me that, it's just part of my day-to-day life and my health. But that peer support is what refuels me and being able to speak to other people. If you are interested and you're not sure, reach out. You can always find people like me and Mark online and just have an informal chat and kind of ask a bit around other people. If it's somewhere where you're going to be adding yourself into a group that's already there, have some informal conversations, and just find out, is it actually really valued? And if you find that you're in a position where you're not feeling valued, step away. It's not worth it. You can't change the dinosaurs sometimes, that people are hard-headed, are going to do it a particular way. If you're not comfortable, move on and find somewhere else that they're going to value your input. It is, what you have to say is important, and it's important that you feel safe and secure when you're sharing.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. And also, I guess, don't share anything you don't feel comfortable sharing.
And if you do,
nobody has the right to say,
yes,
you've got to tell me this.
But sometimes you might share. I think,
Yeah,
I've overshared, so definitely an oversharer. And then just make sure you have a support network so that you can go away and kind of go, oh, you know what, did I overshare? Sometimes you feel like you've overshared, and actually people are like, oh no, it was great. And you just need that reassurance sometimes.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mark, what's the one thing you would say?
Yeah, just to reiterate what was said before, in the sense that I think it's about you learn through experience. So everybody has something valuable to contribute. You're there because you do, but there's no pressure. Just soak it up. Listen, see what other people are. Maybe if there's other lived experience people, you can learn from them. But just take your time and don't feel under any pressure, and you will develop the skills and the confidence to be able to make a really strong contribution. But don't feel under any pressure to just you have to learn that by experience.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And finally, Ruth, what would be your message to someone about to start on this?
I'd say believe that services really genuinely want to hear from you and hear your opinion, and also trust that it will make a difference, because it will.
Brilliant. That's the perfect note to end this session on. Thank you very much. And to those who are watching the recording, we will put a few links in the notes below on YouTube. And thank you very much to everyone who has joined us live.